Everyday Life of the Colonists, 1600s, A Day in Colonial Life. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up not in the 21st century, but in the year 1607. There's no alarm clock buzzing, no phone lighting up with notifications, and no warm shower waiting for you in the bathroom. Instead, the first sound you hear is the rooster crowing outside your small wooden cabin. The floor beneath you creaks, made of rough planks hammered together by your own hands or by the neighbours who helped you build. Your home is simple, so simple that most modern people would call it a shack. The roof is thatched, the windows don't have glass, just oiled paper or wooden shutters. If it's summer, the air is hot and sticky. If it's winter, your breath forms clouds in the freezing air because the tiny fireplace in the corner never quite keeps the chill away. This was the world of the colonists in early 1600s America. Forget the glamorous images from movies of fine coats, banquets, and grand houses. Those came much later. The very first settlers lived with struggle written into every corner of their day. Yet within that struggle, they built routines, traditions, and ways of life that shaped the future of America. Morning in the colonies. When the sun rose, the colony awoke. Colonists rose early, often at dawn, because daylight was their greatest resource. There were no electric lamps or bright city lights, just candles made of animal fat or lanterns fueled by whale oil. Those were expensive, so the workday had to begin with the sunrise. Men and older boys typically went outside to check on livestock or walk to the fields. Women began the day by tending the fire, preparing breakfast, or sewing by the hearth. Children, unless very young, were expected to help, fetching water from the well, gathering kindling, or helping with chores. Breakfast wasn't pancakes and coffee, it was simple and practical. A piece of bread, maybe porridge made of cornmeal, or leftover stew if you were lucky. Colonists ate to survive, not to feast. A world built by hand. Everywhere you looked in the colony, you saw evidence of work. Houses weren't bought, they were built, usually by the people living in them. Settlers used the materials around them, timber from the forest, mud for daub, reeds or straw for thatched roofs. There were no nails in abundance, no bricks shipped in easily. Every structure was a testament to human labor and survival. The settlement itself was small, often surrounded by a wooden palisade wall to protect against wild animals or attacks from rival groups. Inside, there might be a church, a storehouse for food, a meeting hall, and rows of simple homes. Outside, fields stretched into the wilderness, half cleared from the dense forests, and beyond those fields lay the unknown. Colonists were always aware that danger lurked in the woods, wolves, bears, and sometimes hostile encounters with native tribes. Life was not secure, it was fragile, clothing and modesty. Even in these rough conditions, colonists cared deeply about appearances and modesty. Men wore shirts, breeches, stockings, and simple coats, while women wore long dresses, aprons, and coifs, head coverings. Their clothing was practical, but also symbolic. Showing one's respectability mattered. But unlike the rich of England, colonists often wore the same garments repeatedly. Washing clothes was hard work, soap was scarce, and water had to be carried bucket by bucket. Garments were patched, mended, and handed down. Undergarments, what they called shifts for women and long shirts for men, were worn daily and rarely changed. They acted like a barrier between the body and outer clothes, keeping the outer garments from getting too dirty. These humble, simple garments were the foundation of colonial dress, even though they were rarely talked about. Meals and survival food shaped every part of a colonist's day. Unlike us, colonists couldn't simply walk to a store. Everything had to be grown, hunted, or preserved. Breakfast was quick, but the main meal of the day came at midday, and dinner in the evening was often lighter. Corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters crops introduced by Native Americans, became staples. Without these, the colonies would not have survived. Colonists also relied on salted pork, dried fish, and bread baked in outdoor clay ovens. Spices were rare and expensive, so meals were simple, sometimes bland. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was survival. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A broken fishing net could leave families hungry. Colonists thought constantly about food because it was never guaranteed. Children and play. Despite the hardship, children found moments of joy. Their lives were filled with chores, but when they could, they played. Games were simple: rolling hoops, playing tag, tossing stones, or playing with dolls made from corn husks. Toys were handmade, carved by fathers from scraps of wood or sewn by mothers from leftover fabric. There were no plastic toys, no colourful playgrounds. Yet in their small games, children found a world of imagination, racing, pretending, and laughing as children do in every century. Work and responsibility. Colonial life was defined by work. Men laboured in the fields, built houses, chopped wood, hunted game, and repaired tools. Women cooked, sewed, gardened, preserved food, and raised children. Children fetched, carried, and learned skills from their parents. Tools were simple but essential: axes, saws, hammers, ploughs, and fishing nets. Machinery as we think of it today didn't exist. Everything was powered by human strength or by animals like oxen and horses. Every day was a balance between labour and survival. A day wasted could mean hunger in the winter. Nightfall in the colonies. When the sun went down, the settlement grew quiet. Without modern lighting, night was filled with darkness and uncertainty. Families gathered by the fire, eating their final meal, praying and telling stories. Candles were burned carefully, as they were precious. By night, the sounds of the wilderness surrounded the colonists. Wolves howled in the distance, the forest creaked, and the wind rattled the shutters. Families huddled close, grateful for another day survived. Closing of Section 1. This was the rhythm of a colonist's life in the early 1600s. Wake at dawn, labour from sunrise to sunset, eat simply, and hope that tomorrow would not bring sickness, hunger, or loss. It was a life of struggle, but also a life of community, resilience, and quiet strength. And this is only the beginning, because if we step deeper into their world, we uncover the details: the bathrooms they built, the clothes they wore beneath their garments, the ways they bathed and cared for themselves, the toys their children played with, and the tools that shaped their survival. In the next section, we'll walk through the homes and settlements of these colonists, brick by brick, plank by plank, to see exactly how they built their fragile world in the New World. Section 2, Homes and Settlements, How Colonists Built Their World. The birth of a settlement. Imagine arriving in the New World, staring at dense forests stretching endlessly in every direction. There are no streets, no houses, no taverns, no shops, nothing but wilderness. For the first colonists, the greatest challenge wasn't just surviving, it was building a world from nothing. The earliest settlements were not the neat, charming villages that we picture today. They were rough, improvised, and often dangerously unstable. Colonists had to build with what they had, mostly wood, mud, and sheer determination. Jamestown, founded in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement in North America. At first glance, it seemed like a stronghold, a triangular fort made of tall wooden palisade walls. But inside, life was harsh. The cabins were one-room huts with dirt floors and thatched roofs that leaked when it rained. Building materials and techniques. Colonists cut down nearby trees and split logs for walls. They packed mud and clay into the cracks to keep out wind and cold. Roofs were made from reeds, straw, or wooden shingles. Windows, if they existed at all, were covered with oiled paper instead of glass, which was expensive and rare. Doors were simple slabs of wood, often creaky and uneven. Floors were sometimes packed earth. Later, wooden planks became more common. Inside, furniture was handmade: rough benches, tables, and beds stuffed with straw or feathers if you were lucky. For poorer families, even a pile of furs counted as a bed. The fortified town. In Jamestown and other early colonies, survival meant defense. Colonists built tall wooden palisade fences around their settlements. Guard towers were added at corners, giving watchmen a view over the wilderness. At night, gates were locked tight. Beyond the walls lay uncertainty: dense forests filled with wildlife, and native tribes whose relationships with settlers ranged from cautious friendship to open hostility. The palisades were not just fences, they were lifelines. The hearth and home. At the center of every cabin was the hearth, a simple fireplace made of clay or stone. This was the colonists' stove, heater, and gathering place all in one. Families cooked over open flames, smoked meats above the fire, and gathered at night to share warmth. The smoke often filled the room because chimneys were crude. Colonists lived half-choked by smoke, their walls darkened with soot, their lungs heavy with ash. Still, the hearth was the heart of the home, the only place that made a wooden shack feel like a living space. Community structures. As settlements grew, colonists built more than homes. They raised small wooden churches, where sermons lasted hours and religion dominated daily life. Meeting halls served as centers for decisions, trials, and community gatherings. There was often a storehouse, crucial for survival, where grain, salted meat, and tools were locked away. A blacksmith's forge clanged nearby, its smoke rising above the rooftops. Though the settlements were small, every building mattered. Each one was a piece of order carved out of wilderness. Outside the walls. Surrounding the settlement, colonists cleared fields for farming. This was back-breaking work, cutting down trees with axes, pulling stumps from the earth, and ploughing rocky soil. Fences of split rails or woven branches marked fields and kept animals from wandering. Beyond the fields lay the dark forests, filled with game, but also with danger. To the colonists, the wilderness was both a gift and a threat. Life inside the cabin step into a typical colonial home in the early 1600s, and you'd be struck by its simplicity. One room, perhaps two if the family was fortunate, walls of rough wood, a table, a bench, a few stools, a bed shared by parents, with children sleeping on straw pallets on the floor. Light came from tallow candles, dim, smoky, and pungent. Storage was in wooden chests or hanging shelves. Everything was practical, built by hand, meant for survival, not for beauty. Yet for the colonists, these cabins were miracles. Each one represented safety, progress, and the fragile hope of permanence in the new world. Closing of Section 2. The homes and settlements of the early colonists were not grand, but they were lifelines. Every log, every nail, every plank carried the weight of survival. From muddy huts to fortified towns, these structures told the story of human determination. And yet, inside these homes, daily life unfolded in surprising detail: what people wore, what they ate, and even what they hid beneath their garments. In the next section, we'll step inside the wardrobe of the 1600s colonists to uncover the truth about their clothing, their undergarments, and how they dressed for both survival and modesty. Section 3. Food and cooking, from farming to the table. When we picture the earliest American colonies of the 1600s, it's easy to imagine a world of hardship, hunger, and struggle. But food, how it was grown, cooked, and shared, tells us more about these settlers than almost anything else. Their meals were never just meals. They were survival, culture, and community all in one, farming in a new world. The first challenge for colonists was simply learning how to eat in a land they had never known before. Many came from England, where wheat bread, beef, and beer were everyday staples. But in America, the soil, climate, and seasons demanded new methods. Wheat struggled in the stony ground, cattle were scarce, and the constant threat of hunger loomed. Instead, the colonists relied on Native American knowledge. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, became the backbone of survival. These crops thrived in the soil and could be grown together. Corn provided height, beans climbed the stalks, and squash spread low to shade the earth and hold in moisture. Farmers also experimented with barley, rye, peas, and pumpkins. Each harvest season was a gamble. Too much rain and crops rotted, too little and famine returned. Livestock and hunting. While farming stabilized life, meat was a constant craving. Colonists brought over a handful of pigs, chickens, goats, and cattle on early ships. But survival during long voyages meant many animals didn't last. Those that did became precious resources. Pigs adapted quickly, rooting in forests and multiplying fast. Chickens provided eggs, though they were often saved for hatching more birds rather than being eaten. Goats gave milk, while cattle were used carefully for milk and labor before slaughter. Hunting filled the gaps. Men ventured into the forests with muskets and traps, seeking deer, wild turkeys, rabbits, and even bear. Fish and shellfish from rivers and coasts were daily necessities: cod, clams, mussels, and oysters. It was not uncommon to see women and children digging clams along the shore while men cast nets into rivers. Cooking methods and hearth life. Step inside a colonial cabin, and the kitchen was not a separate room. The entire home revolved around the hearth, the wide, smoky fireplace that provided warmth, light, and food. Cooking pots of heavy iron hung from hooks over open flames. Wooden spoons stirred cornmeal mush, stews of beans and meat, and boiled puddings tied in cloth. Ash-baked bread cooked slowly at the fire's edge, while roasting spits turned wild game over embers. Meals were simple, but they were hearty. Every dish was flavored with smoke, ash, and the effort it took to keep firewood cut and flames alive. A mistake, a fire going out in winter, could mean disaster. Bread, cornmeal, and staples. For many colonists, bread was the true test of survival. Wheat bread was rare and treasured. More often, settlers relied on cornbread, johnny cakes, and ash cakes, simple rounds of cornmeal mixed with water and salt, cooked against hot stones or directly in ashes. Porridge was common too. A morning might begin with a bowl of cornmeal mush, sweetened with a trickle of honey or molasses if available. At times, settlers pounded dried corn into hominy and mixed it into hearty stews. Preserving food. With no refrigeration, preservation became a matter of life and death. Smoking houses filled with hanging strips of venison, pork, or fish were common sights inside settlements. Salt, when it could be imported, was a treasure, used to pickle vegetables and cure meat. In autumn, families labored to dry apples, pumpkins, and herbs, storing them in wooden barrels or clay jars. Winter survival depended on what could be stored, hidden away from rodents, and kept safe from dampness. Mealtime and community. A meal was more than food, it was ritual and togetherness. Families gathered around rough wooden tables, often eating from shared trenchers, flat wooden or pewter plates. Forks were rare. Most colonists ate with spoons, knives, or simply their hands. Grace before eating was a deeply religious practice, thanking God for what little they had. Even the simplest bowl of corn stew carried meaning. It meant survival for another day. In larger settlements, shared meals took place in taverns, where travellers, farmers, and tradesmen exchanged news over mugs of ale and hearty stews. In good harvest years, meals might be plentiful and merry. In lean years, suppers grew smaller, sometimes nothing more than boiled roots and stale bread. Hunger and starvation. But behind every meal lay fear. Colonists knew the memory of the starving time at Jamestown, when famine, disease, and desperation brought unimaginable suffering. The absence of food haunted every settler. Each bite of bread, every roasted rabbit was never taken for granted. Food was not just sustenance, it was hope. Hope that the land could feed them, that the harvest would last, and that tomorrow would bring another meal. Closing of Section 3. From smoky hearths to shared trenchers, food defined the life of early colonists. It told the story of adaptation, desperation, and determination. Every harvest, every stew, every shared feast was proof that the settlers were learning how to survive in this strange new world. Section 4. Clothing and undergarments, dressing in the New World. When the English colonists first set foot on American soil in the early 1600s, their clothing said as much about them as their language or religion. Clothing wasn't just about fashion, it was about survival, status, modesty, and culture. Every piece, from the heavy wool coat to the simplest linen shift, told the story of adaptation in a harsh, unfamiliar world. Imported styles. Meet harsh reality. Most colonists arrived with clothes straight from England. Men wore breeches, stockings, and coats. Women wore long dresses with aprons and caps. But those garments were designed for English weather, not the extremes of the New World. Thick wool could stifle in humid summers, yet thin linen shifts were hardly enough for freezing winters. Fabrics frayed quickly in rough work, and there were no shops around the corner to replace them. Colonists had to learn to patch, mend, and even spin and weave when supply ships came too rarely. Men's clothing. A colonial man's outfit usually began with a linen shirt. Over this, he wore breeches that tied at the waist and reached the knees, fastened with buttons or ties. Long wool stockings covered the lower legs, and sturdy leather shoes or boots protected the feet. For outer layers, a doublet or simple coat provided warmth. In colder months, men relied on heavy cloaks, hats, and sometimes even improvised fur garments learned from native neighbors. Belts often carried knives, small pouches, or tools, making clothing both practical and necessary for survival. Women's clothing. For women, clothing began with the shift, a long, loose undergarment made of linen. Over this went stays or bodices to shape and support the figure. Dresses, often in two pieces, included a bodice and a skirt, with an apron tied around the waist. A coif or linen cap covered the head, not just for modesty but also to keep hair clean while working. Women's clothing was layered. In winter, woolen petticoats and shawls kept out the cold, while lighter fabrics were worn in summer. Shoes were usually simple leather, tied with laces. Pockets were not sewn into dresses, but worn as separate pouches tied around the waist beneath skirts. Undergarments and modesty. Undergarments were simple but vital. The shift served as both underwear and nightwear, protecting outer clothing from sweat and dirt. Men also wore linen underdrawers or breeches beneath their main trousers. Bathing was infrequent, so undergarments absorbed much of the daily grime. Colonists washed these shifts and drawers more often than outer clothes, making them essential for hygiene. Despite the rough conditions, modesty was highly valued, and even in private, colonists rarely stripped fully bare unless bathing. Fabric and materials. The colonists depended heavily on linen, wool, and leather. Linen was lightweight, cooler in summer, and easier to wash, while wool provided warmth and durability. Cotton was rare and costly at first, only becoming more common later through trade. Leather from cattle and deer became not just shoes, but also jerkins, belts, and gloves. Furs, beaver, fox, raccoon, offered added warmth in the harshest winters, blending Native American practicality with English tradition. Clothing and status clothing also marked social standing. The governor, ministers, or wealthy merchants often wore garments with more color, lace collars, or imported silks when they could afford them. Poor farmers and laborers wore rougher homespun, dyed in simple browns, grays, and blues. But even here in the colonies, sumptuary laws, rules about what people could and could not wear, sometimes followed English custom. Flashy dress was frowned upon, especially among Puritans, who saw excess as sinful vanity. Repair and recycling. One garment might last years, even decades, patched and repurposed until no more could be done. Worn-out dresses became aprons, then rags. Shoes were mended repeatedly by hand. Children often wore hand-me-downs, patched and altered until they nearly fell apart. Nothing was wasted, for every scrap of cloth represented labor, trade, or precious space on a cargo ship. Children's clothing. Children dressed like miniature adults. Boys wore shifts until they were old enough for breeches, a moment called breeching, often marked as a rite of passage. Girls wore small versions of women's gowns and aprons. There were no bright cartoon clothes or playful fabrics, only practical garments meant to withstand hard use. Accessories and headwear was almost universal. Men wore broad-brimmed felt hats or caps, while women wore linen coifs or kerchiefs. Gloves, scarves, and shawls were not just for style, but for real protection from cold and labor. Belts, pouches, and knives were part of daily wear, especially for men who needed tools at hand. Buckles, when available, added shine, though simple ties and buttons were more common. Closing of Section 4. To the colonists, clothing was not fashion for fashion's sake. Every stitch and seam was survival. Every patched hole meant one more season endured. In a world where winters could kill and supplies might not arrive, their garments were their armor, against the cold, against hunger, against the unknown wilderness around them.